Picture this. You've spent 2 years bending over backward to be the perfect mother-in-law. You've written checks, painted nurseries, hosted parties, and bitten your tongue through countless little slights. Then, one Sunday morning, in front of your closest friends and family, your daughter-in-law looks you straight in the eye and tells you that you're too old to attend her baby shower. Too old. At 62. But here's the thing about underestimating someone who's lived 6 decades. On this earth, we've learned a thing or two about strategy. And sometimes the most powerful word in the English language isn't yes, it's no. What my daughter-in-law didn't realize was that her public humiliation would become the catalyst for the most empowering transformation of my life. By the time I was finished, she would learn that respect isn't negotiable, family isn't transactional, and grandmothers aren't pushovers just because we bake cookies and send birthday cards. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Margaret Sullivan Thompson, and until that devastating Sunday morning in March, I thought I had mastered the delicate art of being a mother-in-law. At 62, I had navigated the complex waters of welcoming my son David's wife into our family with what I believed was grace, generosity, and genuine affection. I had convinced myself that the occasional barbed comment or subtle exclusion was simply the natural growing pains of blending families. I was so very wrong. The Westfield Country Club dining room buzzed with the familiar Sunday brunch chatter of Connecticut suburbanites catching up on weekend plans and community gossip. Spring sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting a warm glow over our table where I sat surrounded by the women who had shaped my life for decades. My younger sister Linda, her silver hair perfectly styled as always, was describing her latest gardening triumph. My dearest friend Carol, who had been my anchor through my husband Robert's death 5 years earlier, was laughing at something Patricia had said. Patricia Hendricks, my daughter-in-law's mother, had become a fixture in these brunches over the past 2 years. At 57, she shared my enthusiasm for antique shopping and our book club, and I had genuinely grown fond of her. We had bonded over the shared experience of watching our children navigate marriage, comparing notes on the delicate balance between involvement and interference. The conversation flowed easily around our table, touching on the usual topics: whose grandchildren were excelling in school, which neighbors were planning summer vacations, the latest drama at the Historical Society. I was in my element, surrounded by friendship and familiarity, when Jessica suddenly cleared her throat with the kind of deliberate emphasis that makes everyone stop talking. My daughter-in-law, Jessica, sat beside my son David, her hand resting protectively over her rounded belly. At 7 months pregnant with my first grandchild, she had that ethereal glow that people always talk about, her dark hair catching the light and her brown eyes bright with what I had mistaken for happiness. At 29, she possessed the kind of effortless confidence that I remembered having at her age, before life had taught me that confidence and kindness could coexist. "I have an announcement to make about the baby shower," Jessica said, her voice carrying across our section of the dining room with surprising authority. The warmth in her tone didn't match the calculated look in her eyes, a disconnect I would later recognize as my first real warning sign. I set down my coffee cup and smiled expectantly. For weeks, I had been hoping she would ask me to help plan the celebration. I had already mentally prepared a list of vendors from David's childhood birthday parties, imagined the perfect blend of elegant and whimsical decorations, and even researched the latest trends in baby shower games. My experience hosting events for Robert's law firm had taught me how to create memorable occasions that brought people together. "We've decided to keep it small and intimate," Jessica continued, her gaze moving around the table, but somehow never quite landing on me. "Just the younger crowd, you know. We want it to be energetic and fun, really focused on celebration without any generational gaps or different perspectives on modern parenting." The words hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle. I felt Linda's hand find mine under the table, her fingers squeezing with the kind of protective instinct that had gotten us both through childhood scrapes and adult heartbreaks. Carol's coffee cup paused halfway to her lips, and I watched Patricia's face transform from pleasant anticipation to obvious discomfort. But Jessica wasn't finished. She turned to face me directly, her expression taking on what I can only describe as practiced sympathy. "No offense, Margaret, but we really want this to be more contemporary and energetic. You understand, don't you? Sometimes different generations have different ideas about how to celebrate, and we just want to avoid any potential conflicts or outdated suggestions." The dining room seemed to tilt slightly, as if the elegant hardwood floors had suddenly become unsteady beneath my feet. In all my years of social navigation, through charity board meetings where egos clashed and country club politics where passive aggression was an art form, I had never been so blatantly dismissed. Not just dismissed, publicly humiliated with a smile and a veneer of consideration that made the insult somehow worse than outright rudeness would have been. My son David shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his shoulders tensing in the way they had when he was a teenager caught between conflicting loyalties. At 34, he had inherited his father's diplomatic nature and his mother's stubborn streak, a combination that usually served him well in his career as a marketing director, but apparently left him paralyzed in moments like this. He stared at his untouched eggs Benedict as if they held the secret to navigating family dynamics. The silence stretched uncomfortably around our table while conversations continued normally at neighboring tables, creating a surreal bubble of tension in the middle of casual Sunday socializing. I could feel the weight of expectation pressing down on me, the assumption that I would either create a scene or meekly accept this public rejection with the kind of gracious surrender that had apparently been expected of me all along. "No offense taken," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt, drawing on decades of corporate presentations and charity event speeches where composure was everything. "I'm sure it will be lovely, dear." But inside, something fundamental shifted. The accommodating mother-in-law who had spent 2 years walking on eggshells, who had swallowed countless small slights and explained away dozens of subtle exclusions, quietly died in that moment. In her place, something sharper and more determined began to take shape. I took a deliberate sip of my mimosa, buying myself time to process what had just happened. The beverage tasted bitter now, or perhaps that was just the flavor of public humiliation. Around me, my friends struggled to restart the conversation, with Carol making a valiant attempt to redirect toward safe topics about spring weather and upcoming garden tours. But I found myself studying Jessica with new eyes, seeing patterns I had previously dismissed as personality quirks or stress from pregnancy. The way she had phrased her announcement wasn't spontaneous. It was rehearsed, calculated to sound reasonable while delivering maximum impact. The reference to generational gaps and outdated suggestions wasn't accidental. It was designed to position me as irrelevant and out of touch while appearing to take the high road. My mind began cataloging other moments over the past months when I had felt similar stings but had explained them away as misunderstandings or oversensitivity. The family barbecue where Jessica had loudly thanked Patricia for understanding modern boundaries while I stood 3 feet away. The shopping trip where she had dismissed my suggestions for baby essentials as old-fashioned before purchasing the exact same items recommended by her younger sister. The dinner party where she had introduced me to her coworkers as David's mother who means well but has very traditional ideas. Each incident had seemed minor in isolation, easily rationalized as the normal adjustments of family dynamics. But, viewed together, they formed a pattern of systematic dismissal designed to establish hierarchy while maintaining plausible deniability. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Jessica wasn't just planning a baby shower guest list. She was orchestrating my position in the family structure, and that position was apparently somewhere near the bottom. Linda squeezed my hand again, and I realized I had been quiet for longer than socially comfortable. The conversation had moved on to Patricia's upcoming trip to visit her sister in Florida, but I could feel the undercurrent of tension that my public rejection had created. My friends were loyal enough to be offended on my behalf, but too polite to confront Jessica directly in such a public setting. David finally looked up from his plate, his blue eyes troubled. "Maybe we should talk about this later," he suggested. Quietly, the first words he had spoken since Jessica's announcement. "What's to talk about?" Jessica responded with a bright smile that didn't reach her eyes. "It's just a party, not a family summit. Margaret understands that different events call for different guest lists, don't you, Margaret?" The question was posed as if she were asking about my preference in table linens, casual and inconsequential. But I recognized the challenge underneath. The expectation that I would publicly agree with my own exclusion, that I would validate her decision and make everyone else comfortable with what had just happened. "Of course," I said simply, refusing to elaborate or provide the gracious acceptance speech she seemed to expect. "I'm sure you'll have everything perfectly planned." Something flickered across Jessica's face. Surprise, perhaps, or disappointment that I hadn't played my assigned role more enthusiastically. She had clearly expected either grateful submission or emotional protest, both of which would have served her narrative. My neutral response seemed to throw off her script. The remainder of brunch passed in stilted conversation, with everyone working slightly too hard to maintain normalcy. Carol shared updates about her daughter's promotion. Linda described her plans for her herb garden, and Patricia discussed her book club's latest selection with the kind of forced enthusiasm that comes from desperate attempts to lighten heavy moods. But underneath the pleasant chatter, I felt the weight of what had just occurred settling into my consciousness like sediment at the bottom of a disturbed pond. As we prepared to leave, Patricia approached me while Jessica was in the restroom. Her face was flushed with embarrassment, and she looked as uncomfortable as I felt. "Margaret, I want you to know that I had no idea she was planning to say that today," she said quietly, glancing around to make sure we weren't overheard. "I would never have agreed to exclude you from something so important." Her words were kind, but they also confirmed what I was beginning to suspect, that Jessica's announcement hadn't been spontaneous. She had planned this moment, chosen this venue, and calculated the impact of delivering this news in front of witnesses who would make it impossible for me to respond with anything other than polite acceptance. "Thank you, Patricia," I replied, genuinely. "I appreciate that more than you know." David lingered as the others said their goodbyes, his expression conflicted. "Mom, I'm sorry about how that came out. Jessica's been stressed about the planning, and I think she just wants everything to be perfect." I looked at my son, this kind man I had raised to value fairness and respect, and realized he was already making excuses for behavior that couldn't be excused. Not because he agreed with Jessica's decision, but because acknowledging how wrong it was would require him to take action he wasn't prepared to take. "It's fine, David," I told him, though we both knew it wasn't. "Focus on taking care of Jessica and the baby. That's what matters most right now." As I drove home through the familiar streets of Westfield, past the colonial houses and manicured lawns that had formed the backdrop of my life for over 3 decades, I found myself thinking about the woman I had been before marriage and motherhood had taught me to soften my edges. Margaret Sullivan, the financial advisor who had helped families plan for their futures, who had negotiated contracts and managed difficult clients, who had never apologized for taking up space in a room. That woman had known how to set boundaries. She had understood that respect was earned through strength, not bestowed as a reward for compliance. She had recognized manipulation when she saw it and had never confused kindness with weakness. It was time to reintroduce myself to her, because Jessica had just made the crucial mistake of assuming that grandmother-to-be meant the same thing as pushover. She was about to learn that some women grow more formidable with age, not less, and that publicly humiliating someone who has lived 6 decades on this earth is rarely a winning strategy. The game had begun, though Jessica didn't know it yet. And I had been playing games of strategy and consequence long before she was born. The drive home from the country club gave me time to reflect on how thoroughly I had transformed myself over the past 2 years, molding my personality into what I believed would be the ideal mother-in-law. As I turned onto Maple Street, where the Victorian houses stood like silent witnesses to decades of family dramas, I realized I had become a stranger to myself in the pursuit of acceptance. It had started innocently enough when David first brought Jessica home for Thanksgiving 3 years ago. She was 26 then, fresh from her master's degree in marketing, with opinions about everything from organic food to sustainable fashion. I had been charmed by her confidence, impressed by her ambition, and genuinely excited about the prospect of having a daughter-in-law who seemed so different from the timid young women David had dated in college. But somewhere along the way, my enthusiasm had been interpreted as interference, my experience dismissed as outdated thinking, and my genuine desire to help twisted into something controlling and manipulative. I had bent myself into increasingly uncomfortable shapes trying to prove that I wasn't the stereotypical overbearing mother-in-law, and in doing so, I had lost sight of who I actually was. The transformation had been gradual and insidious. When Jessica mentioned preferring contemporary home decor, I had quietly packed away the antique wedding gifts I had planned to pass down, replacing them with sleek modern pieces that felt cold and impersonal in my hands. When she expressed interest in nutrition and wellness trends, I had abandoned my traditional family recipes in favor of quinoa salads and kale smoothies that left me perpetually hungry and unsatisfied. Most significantly, I had learned to edit my words carefully, filtering every opinion through the lens of how Jessica might receive it. My natural tendency toward direct communication, honed through decades of successful business relationships, had been replaced by a constant internal dialogue of second-guessing and self-censorship. I had become an actress playing the role of the accommodating mother-in-law, so committed to the performance that I had forgotten my authentic self underneath the costume. The engagement party I had hosted 18 months ago exemplified this complete personality makeover. Instead of the elegant but personal celebration I would have naturally planned, featuring family traditions and meaningful touches, I had hired Jessica's preferred caterer and decorator, resulting in an event that looked like it belonged in a magazine but felt utterly foreign in my own home. I had spent the evening smiling and nodding as guests complimented the sophisticated aesthetic, while internally mourning the absence of the warmth and character that usually defined my entertaining style. The wedding planning process had been an exercise in systematic exclusion disguised as collaboration. Jessica had established a clear hierarchy from the beginning, with her mother Patricia serving as the primary advisor, and me relegated to writing checks and offering opinions that were politely received and promptly ignored. When I suggested incorporating some of our family traditions, Jessica had explained that she preferred to start fresh without the weight of generational expectations. When I offered to share my grandmother's pearl necklace as her something old, she had thanked me sweetly before choosing a contemporary piece that better matched her vision. Each rejection had been delivered with such apparent consideration for my feelings that I had convinced myself I was being overly sensitive. Jessica had a gift for making exclusion sound like inclusion, for presenting dismissal as protection of my interests. She would explain that she didn't want to burden me with too many responsibilities, or that she was saving me from stress by handling things herself. The language of consideration masked the reality of control, and I had been too eager to avoid conflict to examine the pattern closely. The house hunting process had followed the same script. When David and Jessica began looking for their first home together, I had offered to help with research, having considerable experience in real estate from my years helping clients evaluate investment properties. But Jessica had already enlisted her younger sister Sarah as her primary advisor, explaining that she valued a fresh perspective on the market. My offer to contribute to their down payment had been accepted gratefully, but my suggestions about neighborhoods and property values had been politely deflected. When they finally chose the Colonial in Stamford, I had thrown myself into helping them settle in with the kind of enthusiasm I would have shown for my own children. I had spent 3 consecutive weekends painting their guest bedrooms, assembling furniture from complicated instruction manuals, and organizing their kitchen according to Jessica's very specific preferences. I had researched the best local services, from lawn care to house cleaning, and compiled detailed lists of recommendations that I presented like homework assignments, eager to prove my usefulness. But even my helpfulness had somehow become problematic. Jessica had begun making comments about feeling overwhelmed by my involvement, suggesting that my assistance came with expectations of gratitude or control that made her uncomfortable. She had started declining my offers to help with increasingly elaborate explanations about wanting to figure things out themselves or needing to establish their own systems without outside influence. The monthly financial assistance had evolved, gradually, almost imperceptibly. It had started when Jessica mentioned struggling to balance her part-time work at the boutique with wedding planning expenses. I had quietly begun slipping David cash during our coffee dates, telling him it was to take Jessica somewhere nice or to ease the pressure of wedding costs. After the wedding, when Jessica reduced her hours to focus on getting pregnant and preparing for family life, the assistance had increased to help cover their mortgage shortfall. I had never mentioned these contributions to anyone, not even Linda or Carol, because I understood instinctively that Jessica would be mortified if our financial arrangement became public knowledge. Her pride in her independence was fierce, and I had convinced myself that my discretion was an act of kindness, rather than an acknowledgement of the uncomfortable power dynamic I was perpetuating. The pregnancy announcement had initially filled me with hope that our relationship might improve. Surely becoming a grandmother would give me a meaningful role in their lives, a way to contribute that felt natural and welcomed. I had begun researching baby products with the same thoroughness I had once brought to financial analysis, creating spreadsheets comparing car seat safety ratings and nursery furniture options. I had assumed that my experience and resources would finally be valued, that Jessica would welcome guidance from someone who had successfully navigated parenthood. Instead, my enthusiasm had been met with increasing resistance. Jessica had made it clear that she intended to rely primarily on contemporary parenting resources and the advice of her pediatrician, dismissing my suggestions as outdated or potentially harmful. When I mentioned practices that had worked well with David and his sister Amanda, Jessica would counter with recent studies or expert opinions that contradicted old-fashioned approaches. The nursery renovation had become the ultimate symbol of this dynamic. I had offered to fund the project as my gift to my future grandchild, envisioning a beautiful space that reflected both modern safety standards and timeless elegance. But Jessica had taken complete control of the design process, creating a room that was undeniably lovely but felt entirely separate from our family history and traditions. When I had gently suggested incorporating some meaningful pieces, like the antique rocking chair that had been in our family for 3 generations, Jessica had explained that she preferred everything to be cohesive and contemporary. The $25,000 I had transferred to their joint account for the nursery had disappeared into receipts for furniture and accessories that I would never have chosen, creating a space that was beautiful but impersonal. I had stood in the completed room during one of my invited tours, admiring the Instagram-worthy aesthetic while feeling like a stranger viewing someone else's life through a window. My relationship with their golden retriever Max had become a metaphor for my entire position in their household. I was useful for practical purposes like pet sitting when they traveled or needed time alone, but I wasn't considered part of their daily emotional landscape. Max was always happy to see me, greeting me with uncomplicated enthusiasm that contrasted sharply with the careful politeness I received from his human parents. I had begun looking forward to my dog-sitting duties because they were the only times I felt genuinely needed, rather than merely tolerated. The birthday and holiday celebrations had followed predictable patterns of inclusion that felt more like obligation than genuine desire for my presence. I would be invited to mark the occasion, but the planning and decision-making happened without my input, and my contributions were accepted with the kind of gratitude that suggested burden rather than appreciation. I had learned to bring gifts that were safe and expected rather than personal and meaningful, because personal touches were inevitably received with polite confusion rather than recognition of the thought behind them. Even my relationship with David had begun to suffer under the weight of these careful negotiations. Our once easy communication had become strained as he found himself constantly mediating between his mother and his wife, translating concerns, and smoothing over conflicts that shouldn't have existed in the first place. I had watched my confident, decisive son become increasingly diplomatic and evasive, choosing his words carefully, even in our private conversations, to avoid saying anything that might create problems at home. The realization that I had allowed myself to become a secondary character in my own family's story hit me like a physical blow as I pulled into my driveway. The house that Robert and I had filled with laughter and family traditions felt too quiet, too empty of the grandchildren's voices I had imagined echoing through these rooms. I had sacrificed my authentic self on the altar of family harmony, and the result was neither harmony nor genuine family connection. That evening, unable to shake the humiliation of the morning's events, I found myself doing something I rarely did: scrolling mindlessly through social media. Technology had never been my strength, but Linda had convinced me to join Facebook and Instagram to stay connected with distant relatives and old friends. Mostly, my account sat dormant except for the occasional family photo or holiday greeting. But tonight, something drove me to dig deeper into the digital lives of the people who had just excluded me so publicly. It started innocently enough, looking at Jessica's recent posts about her pregnancy journey and nursery preparations. The photos were beautiful, professionally composed images of her growing belly, carefully arranged nursery details, and tender moments with David that painted a picture of perfect domestic bliss. What struck me first was how completely absent I was from this narrative. Despite my financial contributions and physical presence at many of these moments, the story Jessica was telling the world contained no trace of my involvement. The nursery I had funded was presented as their creative achievement. The furniture I had helped assemble was showcased without acknowledgement of the assistance. Even family gatherings were cropped and captioned to minimize my presence while highlighting Jessica's mother and sister. But it was the comments section that truly opened my eyes to the extent of the narrative Jessica had been crafting about our relationship. Friends and acquaintances were responding to her posts with sympathy and support that seemed disproportionate to the content being shared. Comments like, "So glad you're setting healthy boundaries," and "Good for you for prioritizing." Your mental health began to make sense only when I realized there was a broader context I had been excluded from. Through a mutual friend's account, I discovered Jessica's secondary Instagram profile, one that was more personal and candid than her main account. The friend had tagged Jessica in several photos from recent gatherings, and clicking through revealed a treasure trove of posts I had never seen. This was where Jessica shared her unfiltered thoughts about pregnancy, marriage, and family dynamics, and where I finally understood the full scope of what had been happening behind the scenes of our relationship. The posts dated back over a year, creating a timeline of growing resentment and calculated boundary setting that recontextualized every interaction we had shared. A post from 6 months ago showed a photo of their kitchen with the caption, "Learning to cook without constant suggestions and helpful modifications from people who think their way is the only way. Sometimes you have to establish independence even when it hurts people's feelings." Another post from around the time of the nursery renovation featured a close-up of paint samples with text that read, "Grateful for family members who understand that new parents need space to make their own decisions without interference from people who raised kids in a completely different era. Not everyone gets it, but the ones who matter do." The most painful discovery was a series of posts about toxic family dynamics and emotional manipulation disguised as generosity. Jessica had written extensively about dealing with relatives who used financial support as a way to maintain control, who couldn't respect boundaries, and who made everything about themselves instead of supporting the actual parents-to-be. You see, descriptions were vague enough to maintain plausible deniability, but specific enough that anyone who knew our family situation would understand exactly who she was referencing. One post in particular made my hands shake as I read it. Having to constantly manage someone's hurt feelings because they can't accept that their parenting advice isn't wanted or needed. Financial generosity doesn't entitle anyone to decision-making, power. But some people never learned that lesson. Grateful for my partner who finally understands the importance of protecting our little family from people who can't respect our autonomy. The comments on these posts revealed an entire community of support rallying around Jessica's version of events. Friends shared their own stories of overbearing in-laws, offering advice about setting firmer boundaries and protecting nuclear family relationships from extended family interference. Several people praised Jessica for her maturity in handling difficult older relatives who couldn't adapt to modern family dynamics. But the most devastating discovery was buried in the comments of a post about the upcoming baby shower. Someone had asked about grandparent involvement in the planning, and Jessica had responded with a lengthy explanation about how she was keeping things simple and age-appropriate to avoid generational conflicts about how celebrations should be handled. She had specifically mentioned concerns about outdated expectations and different values around what's appropriate for modern families. Multiple friends had responded with support for her decision, sharing their own experiences of baby showers that had been ruined by older relatives who didn't understand contemporary celebration styles. The conversation painted a picture of generational warfare, where anyone over 50 was portrayed as hopelessly out of touch and potentially disruptive to important milestones. Reading through months of these posts was like discovering that someone had been writing a negative biography of me without my knowledge, crafting a narrative where my every action was interpreted through the lens of control and manipulation. Acts of generosity became attempts at control. Offers of help became interference. Expressions of excitement about becoming a grandmother became inappropriate pressure and boundary violations. The most chilling realization was how calculated and consistent this narrative had been. Jessica hadn't simply been venting frustrations or working through normal adjustment issues. She had been systematically building a case against me, documenting every interaction that could be reframed as problematic, and sharing that documentation with a community that validated her perspective without ever hearing mine. I found evidence of conversations with friends about managing our relationship, strategies for accepting financial help while maintaining emotional distance, and detailed discussions about post-baby boundaries that would limit my access to my grandchild. Jessica had been planning my marginalization with the same thoroughness that other people plan vacation itineraries, researching legal rights of grandparents and consulting friends who had successfully distanced themselves from difficult, extended family members. The betrayal felt deeper than simple dislike or personality conflict. This was strategic exclusion, carefully orchestrated to appear reasonable and necessary while systematically destroying my reputation within our social circle. Jessica had weaponized my own generosity against me, accepting my financial support, while simultaneously portraying that support as manipulative and inappropriate. But perhaps the most painful discovery was evidence that David was not just aware of this narrative, but had become an active participant in it. Comments and private message screenshots revealed that he had been sharing his own frustrations about managing my expectations and protecting Jessica from my alleged interference. My own son had been contributing to conversations about how to handle me more effectively. One screenshot showed a conversation where David had told Jessica that he was working on getting me to back off and give them more space. Another showed him agreeing that my excitement about the pregnancy was overwhelming and that they needed to establish clearer boundaries about my involvement in their lives. The son I had raised to value honesty and directness had been discussing me behind my back like a problem to be managed rather than a person to be respected. As I scrolled through months of evidence that my family had been systematically undermining me while accepting my financial and emotional support, I felt something shift inside me that went beyond anger or hurt. This was a betrayal that required a response, not just an emotional reaction. The business skills I had suppressed in favor of accommodating family harmony suddenly felt more relevant than they had in years. Jessica had made a crucial error in her campaign against me. She had documented everything, creating a digital paper trail that revealed not just her feelings, but her strategies and intentions. In her eagerness to build support for her position, she had provided me with evidence of exactly how calculating and manipulative her behavior had been. She had handed me the roadmap of her own game plan, and now I could use it against her. Sunday dinner had been a tradition in our family for over 15 years, established during David's high school years when our lives were busy enough that we needed to schedule time together. Even after Robert's death, even through David's college years and early career, we had maintained this weekly gathering as a cornerstone of our family connection. It was sacred time, protected from work obligations and social commitments, dedicated to maintaining the bonds that held us together. The week following the country club humiliation, I approached Sunday dinner with a strategy rather than the usual maternal anticipation. For the first time in 2 years, I was attending this family gathering as an informed participant rather than a naive target. The digital evidence I had uncovered during my late-night investigation had transformed my understanding of every interaction, every conversation, every seemingly innocent comment from both Jessica and David. I spent Saturday preparing the meal with unusual deliberation, choosing dishes that had been family favorites long before Jessica entered our lives. Instead of the contemporary fusion recipes I had been attempting to accommodate her dietary preferences, I returned to the classic roast beef dinner that had been Robert's favorite and David's requested birthday meal throughout his childhood. The gesture felt like reclaiming territory that had been slowly ceded without my conscious agreement. The dining room table was set with my grandmother's china, the delicate Limoges pattern that Jessica had once described as too formal for casual family dinners. The silver candlesticks that had been wedding gifts from Robert's parents took their place at the center of the table, flanked by fresh flowers from my garden rather than the modern arrangements I had been purchasing to match Jessica's aesthetic preferences. Every detail was chosen to remind everyone present that this was my house, my table, and my family tradition. When David and Jessica arrived promptly at 5 o'clock, I greeted them with the same warmth I had always shown. But there was a subtle difference in my demeanor that I could see David noticed immediately. Jessica, 7 months pregnant and glowing, with health, seemed more animated than usual, perhaps emboldened by the success of her public dismissal of me at the country club. "Something smells amazing," David said, kissing my cheek with the familiar affection that made my heart ache when I considered how he had been discussing me behind my back with his wife. "It's been forever since you made the Sunday roast." "I thought it was time to return to some of our family traditions," I replied, meeting his eyes with a directness that made him shift slightly. "Sometimes we spend so much energy adapting to new preferences that we lose sight of what made our gatherings special in the first place." Jessica settled into her usual chair, her hand resting on her rounded belly as she surveyed the formal table setting with an expression I couldn't quite read. "This is lovely, Margaret, though maybe a bit elaborate for a casual family dinner. I hope you didn't go to all this trouble just for us." The comment was perfectly pitched to sound appreciative, while subtly suggesting that my efforts were excessive and potentially burdensome. 6 months ago, I would have immediately begun apologizing and explaining, reassuring her that it was no trouble while privately questioning whether I had indeed been inappropriate in my preparation. Tonight, I simply smiled. "No trouble at all," I said, beginning to serve the meal with practiced efficiency. "I enjoy creating special experiences for the people I love, It's one of the privileges of being the hostess. Something in my tone must have registered differently than usual, because Jessica's eyes sharpened slightly. She was accustomed to my responses being either defensive explanations or eager accommodations of her criticism. This calm acceptance of my own choices seemed to throw her off balance in a way that was immediately visible. During the first course, the conversation followed familiar patterns of David sharing updates from work, while Jessica offered commentary on their neighborhood developments and pregnancy preparations. But I found myself listening with different ears, hearing subtext and strategy, where I had previously heard only normal family conversation. When Jessica mentioned meeting with their pediatrician to discuss feeding schedules and sleeping arrangements, she made a point of emphasizing how important it was to follow current medical recommendations, rather than outdated practices that might seem logical but aren't actually safe. The comment was directed at me with the kind of pointed clarity that had become her signature approach to education by implication. "That sounds very thorough," I replied calmly, passing the roasted vegetables. "I'm sure you'll make whatever decisions feel right for your family." David looked surprised by the brevity of my response. He had grown accustomed to these moments becoming opportunities for me to share experiences from his own childhood, or offer gentle suggestions based on my parenting experience. My failure to take the bait seemed to create an uncomfortable vacuum, where a familiar dynamic had been expected. Jessica tried again, this time more directly. "We've been reading about the importance of establishing consistent routines from the very beginning, without too many different influences or conflicting approaches from extended family members. The books all emphasize how confusing it can be for babies when grandparents and other relatives have different ideas about feeding and sleeping and discipline." The manipulation was more obvious this time, the educational facade barely concealing the boundary-setting message underneath. Jessica was using the authority of unnamed experts to establish rules about my future involvement with my grandchild, presenting her preferences as medical necessity rather than personal choice. "I'm sure you'll figure out what works best for your specific situation," I responded, cutting my roast beef with deliberate precision. Every family has to find their own balance between tradition and innovation. The neutral acknowledgement seemed to frustrate Jessica more than direct resistance would have. She had prepared for an argument about grandparent rights or generational differences, ready to position herself as the reasonable voice of modern parenting against my outdated interference. My refusal to engage in that particular battle apparently felt like a tactical retreat that offered no satisfaction or resolution. David attempted to redirect the conversation toward safer topics, sharing amusing stories from his office and asking about my upcoming garden club meeting. But Jessica seemed unable to let go of her unsuccessful attempt to provoke a reaction from me. Throughout the main course, she continued making oblique references to boundary setting and the importance of nuclear family autonomy, each comment slightly more pointed than the last. When she mentioned how grateful she was for friends who understood the challenges of managing family expectations during pregnancy, I saw my opportunity to test the waters of my new approach. "It must be comforting to have such a supportive network," I said, meeting her eyes directly. "Social media can be wonderful for finding people who validate our experiences and perspectives." Jessica's face went slightly pale, and I watched her process whether my comment was innocent conversation or evidence that I had somehow discovered her online commentary about our relationship. The moment of uncertainty that crossed her features confirmed that she understood exactly what I might be referencing. "Yes, it's nice to connect with other women going through similar experiences," she replied carefully, her previous confidence replaced by visible caution. For the remainder of the meal, Jessica seemed less sure of herself, her commentary more measured, and her attempts at boundary setting more subtle. David noticed the shift in energy between us, but seemed unsure how to interpret or address it. The comfortable rhythm of our family dinners had been disrupted, but not in the explosive way that Jessica had apparently been anticipating. When it came time for dessert, I served Jessica's favorite chocolate cake, the recipe I had perfected through multiple trials after learning about her preferences. But instead of the pleased surprise she had shown at previous gestures of consideration, she seemed almost suspicious of the attention. "This is delicious," she said, though her tone suggested she was analyzing the gesture for hidden meaning. "You really didn't need to make my favorite dessert." "I wanted to," I replied simply. "Sometimes the best way to show love is through small acts of thoughtfulness." The word love seemed to hang in the air with unexpected weight. Jessica had grown accustomed to my expressions of affection being coupled with requests for inclusion or acceptance. The absence of any apparent agenda behind this gesture seemed to make her more uncomfortable than direct confrontation would have. As they prepared to leave, David lingered in the kitchen while Jessica gathered her purse and coat. His expression was troubled, and I could see him struggling with something he wanted to say but couldn't quite formulate. "Mom, is everything okay? You seem different tonight." I dried my hands on the kitchen towel, considering my response carefully. "I'm perfectly fine, sweetheart. Maybe I'm just learning to express myself more directly instead of trying so hard to anticipate what everyone else needs from me." He studied my face, clearly sensing that something fundamental had shifted, but unable to identify exactly what had changed. "If there's anything you want to talk about, you know I'm here, right?" The irony of his offer, given what I had discovered about his private conversations with Jessica, was almost overwhelming. But I managed to smile genuinely at this son I loved despite everything. "I know, David, and I appreciate that more than you realize. Take care of Jessica and that precious baby, and don't worry about me. I'm discovering that I'm more resilient than I sometimes remember." As I watched them drive away, I felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with victory or revenge. For the first time in 2 years, I had been completely myself at my own dinner table. I had not apologized for my choices, explained away my preferences, or sought approval for my perfectly reasonable behavior as a hostess and family member. Jessica had expected either capitulation or confrontation, but I had given her something much more unsettling: indifference to her approval. The realization that her opinion of me no longer governed my actions had been liberating for me, and apparently threatening for her. The power dynamic that had defined our relationship for 2 years had shifted in the space of one evening, and we both knew it. The transformation that had begun with Sunday dinner continued throughout the following week, but this time it was happening behind the scenes where Jessica couldn't monitor or attempt to control it. For 2 years, I had been reactive in our relationship, responding to her initiatives and adapting to her preferences. Now I was becoming proactive, taking control of my own narrative and making strategic decisions about my future role in this family. The first phone call I made was to James Harrison, the attorney who had handled Robert's estate and had been our family lawyer for over a decade. James was a contemporary of mine, someone who had known our family through both triumph and tragedy, and I trusted his discretion as much as his legal expertise. When I called his office Monday morning, his secretary immediately put me through. "Margaret, how wonderful to hear from you. How can I help you today?" "James, I need to discuss some family financial planning, specifically regarding gifts and trusts I've established for my future grandchildren. I want to understand my options for modifying the terms and conditions." There was a brief pause, and I could hear the sound of papers shuffling as James likely pulled my file. "Of course. Are we talking about the education trust you established last year, or the broader inheritance planning we discussed after Robert's death?" "Both, actually. I'm beginning to question whether the current structure serves the best interests of family relationships, and I want to explore alternatives that might provide better outcomes for everyone involved." We scheduled a meeting for later that week, and James assured me that we would have complete privacy to discuss any modifications I might want to consider. The conversation left me feeling empowered in a way I hadn't experienced since my corporate days, when solving complex problems required research, strategy, and decisive action rather than emotional accommodation. My second call was to Elena Rodriguez, the financial advisor who had helped me manage my investments since Robert's death. Elena was brilliant with numbers and had always respected my analytical approach to financial planning, even during the grief-stricken months when I had been barely functional. She had helped me structure my finances to provide security while also allowing for generous support of my children's lives. Elena, I want to review the monthly transfers I've been making to David's account. I'm considering some changes to how I structure my family financial support. Certainly, Margaret. Let me pull up your account details. Yes, I see the monthly transfers you established 6 months ago, plus several larger one-time transfers for specific purposes. Are you thinking about increasing the amounts, or are there other modifications you'd like to consider? Actually, I'm considering whether these transfers are serving their intended purpose. I want to explore options that might provide more accountability and clarity about expectations on both sides. Elena was too professional to ask directly about family tensions, but her tone suggested she understood that financial relationships often became complicated when they weren't properly structured from the beginning. We scheduled a comprehensive review for Thursday afternoon, and I felt another piece of my strategic planning falling into place. The most important call I made was to my daughter Amanda in California. As a family therapist with her own thriving practice, Amanda had been watching the Jessica situation develop with professional concern and personal frustration. She had tried to offer gentle guidance over the past year, but I had been too committed to accommodation to hear her warnings about enabling behaviors and boundary violations. Mom, I'm so glad you called. I've been worried about you since our last conversation. How are things going with the baby shower situation? That's actually why I'm calling, sweetheart. I think it's time I stopped pretending that this is a normal adjustment period and started addressing it as the systematic exclusion that it actually is. I could hear the relief in Amanda's voice. Oh, thank God. I've been watching you twist yourself into pretzels trying to accommodate behavior that would never be acceptable in any other relationship. What changed your mind? I told her about the social media discovery, the documented campaign to undermine my reputation while accepting my financial support, and the realization that both Jessica and David had been discussing me as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be respected. Mom, what you're describing isn't just inconsiderate behavior. It's emotional manipulation combined with financial exploitation. Jessica has been systematically isolating you while maintaining access to your resources, and David has been enabling it by refusing to address the double standard. Amanda's professional validation of what I had been experiencing was enormously helpful. She helped me understand that my impulse toward accommodation had been normal and healthy, but that continuing to accommodate abuse was neither normal nor healthy. She also confirmed that setting financial boundaries wasn't punishment, but rather a natural consequence of the relationship dynamics that had been established. What are you thinking about doing? She asked. I'm exploring my options. Legal options, financial options, and personal boundary options. I want to be prepared for whatever comes next. I'm proud of you, Mom. And if you need any professional resources or consultation, I have colleagues who specialize in family systems and financial boundary setting. You don't have to navigate this alone. The conversation with Amanda gave me something I hadn't realized I was missing: professional validation that my concerns were legitimate and my planned responses were appropriate. For 2 years, I had been questioning my own perceptions and reactions, wondering if I was being too sensitive or unreasonable in my expectations. Having a trained therapist confirm that the behavior I was experiencing was genuinely problematic felt like permission to trust my own instincts again. Wednesday afternoon, I drove to Hartford to meet with Patricia, Jessica's mother, at a small cafe halfway between our towns. Patricia had suggested the meeting after sending me a careful text. message saying she had some concerns she wanted to discuss privately. I suspected she had been doing her own detective work about the family dynamics that were affecting both of us. Patricia was already seated when I arrived, looking uncharacteristically serious as she stirred her coffee. We had become genuine friends over the past 2 years, bonding over our shared experience of becoming mothers-in-law and our mutual interests in gardening and literature. I had valued her perspective and enjoyed her company, which made the current situation even more painful. Margaret, I need to apologize for what happened at the country club. I had no idea Jessica was planning to exclude you so publicly, and I want you to know that I completely disagree with her approach. Thank you, Patricia. That means more to me than you know. But there's something else I need to tell you, and it's going to be difficult to hear. Patricia took a deep breath. Jessica has been asking me to participate in what she calls boundary setting with you. She's wanted me to stop including you in our book club discussions and to decline invitations to events where you'll be present. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. Jessica hadn't been content with excluding me from her own events. She had been trying to isolate me from relationships I had developed independently of her. What did you tell her? I told her that my friendship with you is separate from her relationship with you, and that I wouldn't be manipulated into choosing sides in family conflicts that don't involve me. But Margaret, I think you need to know that she's been having similar conversations with other people in our social circle. Patricia went on to explain that Jessica had been systematically working to undermine my relationships within our community, sharing her version of our family dynamics with mutual acquaintances and positioning herself as the reasonable victim of my alleged controlling behavior. She had been particularly focused on other mothers-in-law, warning them about the dangers of being too involved and sharing my situation as a cautionary tale. She's been very strategic about it, Patricia continued. She never says anything directly critical, but she shares these stories about feeling overwhelmed by family expectations and having to protect her marriage from outside interference. Anyone listening would understand exactly who she's talking about. The scope of Jessica's campaign was breathtaking in its thoroughness and chilling in its calculation. She hadn't simply been venting frustrations or working through adjustment issues. She had been conducting a systematic character assassination designed to isolate me socially while maintaining plausible deniability about her intentions. Why are you telling me this, Patricia? Because what she's doing is wrong, and because I'm afraid of what might happen after the baby is born if she continues down this path. I've seen how she's been treating you, and I don't think it's going to get better without some serious intervention. Patricia and I spent another hour discussing the situation, and she offered to provide documentation of Jessica's attempts to manipulate our mutual relationships if I needed it for any legal or family discussions. She also warned me that Jessica was planning to implement even stricter boundaries after the baby's birth, potentially limiting my access to my grandchild to brief, supervised visits on holidays. By the time I drove home from that meeting, I understood that I was dealing with something far more serious than normal family adjustment issues. Jessica had been conducting a calculated campaign to establish herself as the victim and me as the aggressor, building a foundation for future control that would potentially cut me off from my grandchild while maintaining access to my financial resources. The realization was devastating, but it was also clarifying. This wasn't a situation that could be resolved through continued accommodation or patient understanding. This was a power struggle that required strategic response, and I finally felt prepared to engage in it on my own terms, rather than constantly reacting to Jessica's initiatives. That evening, I sat in Robert's old study, surrounded by the legal and financial documents I had been accumulating throughout the week. For the first time since his death, I felt like the competent, strategic woman I had been during my career, rather than the diminished version of myself I had become in my attempts to be the perfect mother-in-law. Jessica had made a critical error in her campaign against me. Thursday morning arrived with the kind of crisp October clarity that usually filled me with energy and optimism. But as I sat at my kitchen island with my first cup of coffee, watching the maple trees in my backyard shed their golden leaves. I felt the weight of everything I had discovered settling into my consciousness like sediment after a storm. The comfortable illusions I had maintained about my family relationships had been stripped away, leaving me to confront realities I could no longer ignore or rationalize. The kitchen around me told the story of my transformation over the past 2 years. The sleek espresso machine that had replaced my beloved old coffee maker because Jessica preferred authentic coffee experiences. The contemporary fruit bowl that had displaced my grandmother's hand-painted ceramic piece because it was more functional and less cluttered. Even my refrigerator had been gradually reorganized to accommodate the organic, locally sourced items that Jessica considered appropriate for family gatherings, pushing aside the comfort foods and familiar brands that had sustained our family for decades. I realized that this kitchen, which had once been the heart of our family life, had become a museum of accommodation, each surface reflecting another small surrender to someone else's preferences. The cumulative effect was a space that looked like it belonged in a design magazine, but felt utterly foreign to the woman who cooked in it daily. I had systematically erased my own taste and history in the pursuit of acceptance that was never going to come. The phone rang just after 8 o'clock, and David's name appeared on the screen. My heart did its familiar skip of maternal anxiety, wondering if something was wrong with Jessica or the baby, but his voice when I answered was cautious rather than urgent. "Mom, do you have a few minutes to talk? I wanted to follow up on last night's dinner. You seemed different." Different. It was such a diplomatic word, characteristic of the way David had learned to navigate the competing demands of his wife and his mother. He had become expert at identifying problems without directly addressing them, acknowledging tensions without taking sides, and managing relationships rather than participating in them authentically. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just having my morning coffee and enjoying the fall weather. How are you feeling about becoming a father? We haven't talked much about that lately." There was a pause, and I could almost hear him recalibrating his approach to the conversation. He had called expecting to discuss my behavior at dinner, but I had redirected toward his experience and feelings instead. It was a small shift, but it represented something larger about how I was beginning to approach our relationship. "I'm excited, nervous, all the usual things, I guess." "Mom, can I ask you something directly?" "Of course." "Are you upset about the baby shower situation? Jessica's been worried that she hurt your feelings, and she doesn't want there to be tension between you two, especially with the baby coming." The careful phrasing revealed so much about how my son had learned to manage family dynamics. Jessica was worried rather than apologetic. There might be tension rather than acknowledgement of deliberate exclusion. The baby shower had become a situation rather than a calculated public humiliation. Even David's language had been shaped by the need to minimize and neutralize conflict rather than address it honestly. "David, I want you to listen to me carefully because I'm only going to say this once. I am not upset about the baby shower. I understand perfectly that Jessica wants to celebrate with people who make her feel supported and comfortable. What concerns me is the pattern of exclusion and dismissal that the baby shower represents, and what that might mean for my relationship with my grandchild. Mom, I don't think Jessica means to exclude you. She's just very focused on what she thinks will work best for her and the baby. I'm sure that's true, but what works best for Jessica seems to consistently involve minimizing or eliminating my involvement while maintaining access to my financial support. That's not a sustainable dynamic for any relationship." The directness of my response seemed to catch David off guard. He was accustomed to having these conversations with me in circles, with lots of emotional processing and eventual accommodation of whatever Jessica wanted. My matter-of-fact analysis of the relationship dynamics seemed to require a different kind of response than he was prepared to give. "It's not about money, Mom. Jessica appreciates everything you've done for us, but she also wants to feel independent and capable of managing her own family." then she should manage her own family independently. But she can't have it both ways, David. She can't position herself as completely autonomous while expecting me to subsidize that autonomy. Independence means making your own financial choices along with your own social choices. There was a longer pause this time, and I could hear the complexity of his position in the silence. David loved me and appreciated my support, but he also lived with Jessica's dissatisfaction and managed her emotional responses to our relationship daily. He had become invested in keeping everyone happy, rather than ensuring that everyone was treated fairly. What are you saying exactly? I'm saying that I'm going to start making decisions based on how I'm actually treated, rather than how I hope to be treated. If Jessica wants complete autonomy over family decisions, then she should have complete responsibility for family finances as well. If she wants my involvement and support, then she needs to treat me with basic respect and inclusion. Mom, please don't make this about money. That's not fair to any of us. The plea in his voice broke my heart, but it also strengthened my resolve. David had been put in an impossible position by Jessica's approach to our relationship, forced to choose between his wife's comfort and his mother's dignity. But my capitulation hadn't actually made his life easier. It had just enabled a dynamic that was ultimately unsustainable and unhealthy for everyone involved. Sweetheart, this isn't about punishment or manipulation. This is about creating honest relationships based on mutual respect. Right now, Jessica gets to have all the benefits of being part of this family without any of the obligations. That's not fair to you, it's not fair to me, and it's not going to work when the baby arrives. We talked for another 20 minutes, with David alternately defending Jessica's position and acknowledging the validity of my concerns. I could hear him struggling with the recognition that his attempts to keep everyone happy had actually created more problems than they had solved. By the end of the conversation, he hadn't agreed with my perspective, but he had stopped arguing against it. After hanging up, I spent the rest of the morning working in my garden, pulling up the summer annuals and preparing the beds for winter. The physical work felt therapeutic, and the metaphor wasn't lost on me. Sometimes growth requires cutting back, removing what isn't working, and creating space for something healthier to develop. Friday afternoon brought an unexpected opportunity to test my new approach when I encountered Sarah, Jessica's younger sister, at the grocery store in downtown Westfield. Sarah had always been polite to me but distant, clearly following Jessica's lead in maintaining careful boundaries around their family relationships. At 26, she worked as a social media manager for a local marketing firm and shared Jessica's confident, contemporary worldview about family dynamics and generational differences. But something in Sarah's expression when she spotted me in the produce section suggested she had been hoping for this encounter, rather than dreading it. She approached with uncharacteristic directness, abandoning the usual pleasantries about weather and weekend plans. Mrs. Thompson, I'm glad I ran into you. I've been wanting to talk to you about something, but I wasn't sure how to bring it up. Please call me Margaret, and I'm always happy to talk with you, Sarah. What's on your mind? We moved toward a quieter corner of the store, near the organic foods section that Jessica had introduced me to during one of her educational shopping trips, designed to improve my understanding of proper nutrition. Sarah seemed nervous, checking around us as if she were worried about being overheard, which immediately put me on alert that this conversation was going to be significant. It's about Jessica and the way she's been handling things with your family. I need to tell you some things that I don't think you know, and I'm not sure Jessica would want me to share them. The admission that Sarah was preparing to betray her sister's confidence suggested that whatever she needed to tell me was serious enough to overcome family loyalty. I waited patiently while she gathered her courage, recognizing the internal conflict she was experiencing. Jessica has been planning to limit your access to the baby for months. She's been researching grandparents' rights laws and talking to other mothers about how to establish boundaries that would basically cut you out of regular involvement. The information wasn't entirely surprising given what I had already discovered, but hearing it confirmed by someone within Jessica's inner circle felt like a physical blow. Sarah continued, her words coming faster as if she needed to get them out before she lost her nerve. She's been documenting what she calls your boundary violations and building a case for why supervised limited contact would be in the baby's best interest. She has screenshots of texts, notes about conversations, even recordings of phone calls where you were offering advice or expressing excitement about being a grandmother. The revelation that Jessica had been recording our private conversations was deeply disturbing, suggesting a level of premeditation and calculation that went far beyond normal relationship management. I felt simultaneously violated and impressed by the thoroughness of her documentation strategy. Why are you telling me this, Sarah? Because what she's doing is wrong, and because I think you deserve to know what you're dealing with. Jessica is my sister and I love her, but she's become obsessed with controlling every aspect of this pregnancy and the baby's future. She talks about you like you're some kind of threat instead of the grandmother who's been incredibly generous and supportive. Sarah went on to explain that Jessica had been sharing her anti-Margaret strategy with friends and family members, seeking validation for her boundary-setting plans and building a support network for her position. She had created detailed timelines of our interactions, highlighting moments that could be interpreted as overstepping or inappropriate involvement. She even has a group chat with some of her college friends where they discuss toxic in-law management strategies. They share articles about protecting nuclear families from extended family interference and celebrate each other's success in establishing independence from grandparents and other relatives. The image of Jessica participating in group discussions about managing me like a pest problem was both hurtful and enlightening. It confirmed that her approach to our relationship wasn't reactive or emotional, but strategic and collaborative. She had been receiving coaching and encouragement for her exclusion tactics from a community of like-minded women who viewed extended family involvement as inherently problematic. But here's the thing that really bothers me, Sarah continued. Jessica has been accepting your financial help while simultaneously planning to cut you out of the baby's life. She talks about your generosity as if it's evidence of manipulation rather than love, but she's still depositing your checks and using your money for nursery furniture and medical expenses. The confirmation of the financial double standard felt like the final piece of a puzzle I had been trying to solve for months. Jessica had created a narrative where my generosity was suspicious and controlling, but she had no intention of refusing the benefits of that generosity. She wanted complete financial support with zero emotional connection or family obligation. Sarah, can I ask you something? Do you think Jessica's behavior toward me is normal or reasonable? Sarah looked uncomfortable but answered honestly, No, I don't. I think she's been influenced by some of her friends who have their own issues with their families, and she's applying their solutions to problems that don't really exist in your relationship. You've been nothing but kind and supportive, and she's treating you like you're trying to steal her baby or control her marriage. What do you think I should do? I think you should protect yourself. Jessica has been building a case against you for months, and she's not going to stop just because the baby is born. If anything, she's going to get more controlling and more exclusionary once she has the leverage of your grandchild. The conversation with Sarah lasted nearly an hour, with her providing detailed information about Jessica's plans, strategies, and support network. By the time we parted ways, I had a comprehensive understanding of exactly what I was dealing with and how serious Jessica was about limiting my role in my grandchild's life. That evening, I called Amanda to update her on what I had learned. As a family therapist, she was able to provide professional context for Jessica's behavior that helped me understand the psychology behind the strategic exclusion. Mom, what you're describing sounds like someone who has serious control issues and possibly some narcissistic tendencies. The level of planning and documentation you're talking about goes way beyond normal boundary setting. This is someone who sees relationships as power struggles that she has to win. But why is she so threatened by me? I've never tried to undermine her authority or interfere with their marriage. Because you represent something she can't control. You have an independent relationship with David that predates her. You have financial resources that she needs, but can't command. And you have life experience that challenges her sense of expertise. Some people respond to that kind of perceived threat by trying to eliminate it entirely. Amanda helped me understand that no amount of accommodation or boundary respecting on my part was going to satisfy Jessica, because the problem wasn't my behavior, but my existence as an autonomous person with legitimate claims on my son's love and attention. Jessica's goal wasn't reasonable relationship management, but complete control over David's family loyalties. What you need to decide is whether you're going to let her establish the terms of engagement, or whether you're going to insist on your own legitimate place in this family. But you can't do both. You can't keep accommodating someone who is systematically working to marginalize you. The conversation with Amanda crystallized something that had been forming in my mind throughout the week. I was not dealing with someone who could be reasoned with or accommodated into treating me fairly. I was dealing with someone who viewed our relationship as a zero-sum game where my diminishment was necessary for her success. Saturday morning brought the most unexpected development yet when my doorbell rang at 10 o'clock, and I found Rebecca Martinez standing on my front porch. Rebecca was Jessica's cousin, a successful attorney in her early 30s, who had always seemed friendly but professionally distant during family gatherings. She was someone I knew primarily through brief conversations at weddings and holiday parties, but she had always struck me as thoughtful and observant. "Margaret, I hope you don't mind me stopping by unannounced. I was in the neighborhood and wanted to talk to you about something important." I invited her in, curious about what could have prompted this unexpected visit. Rebecca accepted my offer of coffee and settled into my living room with the kind of purposeful composure that suggested she had planned this conversation carefully. "I need to tell you something about Jessica that you probably don't know, and I'm not sure how she would feel about me sharing it, but I think you deserve to understand what you're dealing with." The opening was remarkably similar to Sarah's approach the day before, suggesting that Jessica's behavior was concerning enough that multiple people in her life were feeling compelled to warn me. I waited for Rebecca to continue, preparing myself for another revelation about the scope of Jessica's campaign against me. Jessica asked me to provide legal consultation about grandparents' rights in Connecticut. She wanted to understand exactly what kind of relationship she would be legally required to allow between you and the baby, and what steps she could take to minimize that relationship if she decided it was necessary. The fact that Jessica had sought professional legal advice about limiting my access to my grandchild was more chilling than anything I had discovered so far. It suggested that her planning had moved beyond social strategy into legal preparation, and that she was serious enough about excluding me to invest professional resources in the effort. "What did you tell her?" I told her the truth, which is that in Connecticut, grandparents don't have automatic visitation rights unless there's been a significant pre-existing relationship with the child. The courts generally defer to parental authority unless there's evidence of harm or abandonment. Rebecca went on to explain that Jessica had been particularly interested in strategies for preventing the establishment of a significant relationship between me and the baby. She had asked about limiting overnight visits, restricting unsupervised time, and documenting any behavior that could be characterized as inappropriate or harmful. But here's what really concerned me about our conversation. Jessica wasn't asking these questions because she had legitimate concerns about your behavior or your ability to be a good grandmother. She was asking them because she wanted to establish control over your relationship with the baby before that relationship even began. Did you help her develop strategies for limiting my involvement? Rebecca looked directly at me, her expression serious but sympathetic. I refused to provide advice for what I considered to be preventive restriction of legitimate family relationships. I told Jessica that if she had specific concerns about your behavior, she should address them directly with you rather than building legal barriers against problems that didn't exist. The fact that even Jessica's own cousin had recognized the inappropriate nature of her plans was validating, but it also confirmed how serious Jessica was about implementing them. If she was willing to risk family relationships by seeking legal advice for excluding me, she was clearly committed to following through on her threats. Rebecca, can I ask you for some advice? If Jessica does try to limit my access to my grandchild, what options would I have? Legally, your options would be limited unless you could demonstrate that restriction of your relationship would harm the child's best interests. But practically, there are other approaches you might consider. Rebecca spent the next 30 minutes explaining various strategies for protecting grandparent relationships, including the importance of documenting positive interactions, maintaining financial boundaries that reflected relationship realities, and building support networks within the extended family. She also warned me that Jessica's legal research suggested she was planning to implement restrictions immediately after the baby's birth, when I would be most emotionally vulnerable and least likely to resist. The timing of Jessica's research isn't coincidental. She knows that new grandparents are usually so excited about the baby that they'll agree to almost any conditions just to maintain access. She's planning to use your emotional investment against you. The conversation with Rebecca was eye-opening in ways that went beyond the specific legal information she provided. It confirmed that Jessica's behavior was concerning enough that even her own family members were uncomfortable with her approach, and it provided me with professional validation that my concerns were legitimate and my potential responses were reasonable. More importantly, Rebecca offered to provide ongoing consultation about protecting my interests while maintaining family relationships. As someone who understood both the legal realities and the family dynamics involved, she could help me navigate the challenges ahead without making mistakes that might actually limit my future options. After Rebecca left, I called James Harrison to update him on what I had learned and to accelerate our timeline for implementing the financial boundary changes I had been considering. The information about Jessica's legal research had convinced me that I needed to establish my own protective measures before she could implement her exclusion strategies. James, I need to move forward with modifying the trust and implementing the other changes we discussed. If Jessica is preparing legal strategies for limiting my relationship with my grandchild, I need to have my own protections in place. I understand completely, Margaret. Let me expedite the paperwork and we can have everything in place by early next week. You're absolutely right to protect your interests when you're dealing with someone who has been planning to restrict your family relationships. That afternoon, I also called Elena Rodriguez to finalize the changes to my financial support arrangements. The monthly transfers to David and Jessica would stop immediately, and the nursery fund would be restructured as a conditional trust that required maintaining family relationships for access. Elena, I want to make sure that any future financial support I provide is structured to protect my legitimate interests as a grandmother and family member. I'm not trying to buy anyone's love, but I'm also not going to subsidize my own exclusion from this family. By Sunday evening, I had a comprehensive understanding of Jessica's strategies and plans, professional support for implementing my own protective measures, and a network of allies within her own family who understood that her behavior was inappropriate. For the first time since this situation began, I felt like I was operating from a position of knowledge and strength rather than confusion and accommodation. The week had transformed my understanding of what I was dealing with and what my options were. Jessica had made the mistake of assuming that her careful planning and documentation gave her an insurmountable advantage. But she had underestimated both my resources and my willingness to use them when my family relationships were threatened. Monday morning arrived with the kind of purposeful energy I hadn't felt since my corporate days. After a weekend of revelation and planning, I was ready to begin implementing the strategies I had developed with my team of professional advisors. For too long, I had been reacting to Jessica's initiatives rather than taking control of my own narrative. That was about to change. My first stop was James Harrison's office, where the legal documents that would restructure my financial relationships were waiting for my signature. James had worked through the weekend to prepare everything, understanding the urgency of establishing protections before Jessica could implement her own exclusion plans. Margaret, I want to make sure you understand exactly what these modifications will accomplish, James said as we reviewed the documents together. The trust fund for your grandchild will remain fully funded, but access will be conditional on maintaining meaningful family relationships. The monthly financial support to David and Jessica will stop immediately, and the nursery fund will be converted to a structured education fund with similar relationship requirements. The changes were comprehensive but entirely legal, designed to protect my legitimate interests while providing clear incentives for treating me with basic respect and inclusion. Most importantly, everything was documented with professional precision, creating a paper trail that would support my position if family disputes escalated to legal proceedings. What about the money I've already provided for the nursery renovation? That's more complicated because it was given as an unrestricted gift. However, we can document that the gift was made with the expectation of ongoing family involvement, and future support can be structured to reflect those expectations. I signed the documents with steady hands, feeling a sense of completion that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with self-respect. For 2 years, I had provided financial support without corresponding respect or inclusion. Now my resources would be aligned with my values and my legitimate role as a grandmother. My second stop was the bank, where I needed to implement the practical aspects of the financial restructuring. The monthly transfers to David's account were canceled, the joint nursery account was closed, and the funds moved to a trust account in my name, and I established new documentation requirements for any future financial assistance. Mrs. Thompson, I want to make sure you understand that these changes will be visible immediately to anyone with access to the affected accounts, the bank manager explained. Are you prepared for the family discussions these modifications might prompt? I'm absolutely prepared. In fact, I'm looking forward to having honest conversations about expectations and boundaries for the first time in 2 years. The final element of my strategic implementation was the most important. A carefully crafted letter to David and Jessica explaining the changes and the reasoning behind them. I had spent hours perfecting the language, working with Amanda to ensure that the tone was firm but not punitive, clear but not inflammatory. The letter began by acknowledging my love for both of them and my excitement about welcoming my grandchild. It then explained that I had recently become aware of plans to severely limit my involvement in the baby's life, despite my ongoing financial support of their family. The letter made it clear that I respected their right to make parenting decisions, but that I also had the right to make financial decisions that reflected how I was being treated. I have always believed that family relationships should be based on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than financial obligation, I wrote. Recent events have made it clear that my financial support has not resulted in the kind of family connection I had hoped to build. Therefore, I am restructuring my assistance to better reflect the actual relationship dynamics we have established. The letter explained each financial change in detail, emphasizing that the modifications were not punishment, but rather alignment of resources with relationship realities. The trust fund for their child remained fully intact, but access would require maintaining the kind of family relationships that would benefit the child's development. The monthly support payments were ending because adults who wanted complete autonomy should have complete financial responsibility as well. I am not trying to buy anyone's love or force anyone's gratitude, the letter continued. But I am also not going to subsidize my own exclusion from this family. If you want my involvement and support, I am eager to provide both. If you prefer independence and autonomy, I completely respect that choice. But you cannot have complete independence along with complete financial dependence. The letter concluded by reaffirming my love for David and my hopes for a positive relationship with Jessica and the baby. But it made clear that future interactions would be based on honest expectations rather than my previous pattern of accommodation and financial generosity without corresponding respect. I hand-delivered the letter on Tuesday morning. leaving it in their mailbox along with copies of the relevant legal and financial documents. I also sent copies to James Harrison and Elena Rodriguez for their files, creating a comprehensive record of my reasoning and implementation timeline. The response came faster than I had expected. David called within 3 hours of receiving the letter, his voice tight with anxiety and confusion. "Mom, what is this? Jessica is in tears, and I don't understand what prompted such drastic changes. Can we talk about this?" "Of course we can talk, David. Would you like to come over this evening? I think it would be better to have this conversation in person." Jessica wants to come too. She says there have been some misunderstandings that need to be cleared up. The fact that Jessica wanted to participate in the conversation was interesting, suggesting that she was either prepared to negotiate or ready to escalate the conflict. Either way, I was prepared for both possibilities. She's welcome to come. I think it's time we all had an honest conversation about expectations and boundaries. They arrived at 7 o'clock, both looking more serious than I had seen them in months. Jessica's usual confident composure was replaced by obvious anxiety, and David seemed caught between confusion and frustration. I had prepared for this conversation as carefully as I had prepared for any important business negotiation, with clear objectives and multiple contingency plans. "Mom, I don't understand why you're doing this," David began as soon as we were seated in my living room. "The financial support has never been conditional before. Why are you changing the rules now?" "I'm not changing the rules, sweetheart. I'm finally acknowledging what the rules actually are. For 2 years, I've been providing financial support while being systematically excluded from family decisions and relationships. I've been subsidizing my own marginalization, and that's not sustainable or healthy for anyone." Jessica spoke for the first time since arriving, her voice carefully controlled but obviously emotional. "Margaret, if this is about the baby shower, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I never meant to hurt your feelings, and I certainly didn't mean to exclude you from anything important. Jessica, this isn't about the baby shower specifically. It's about the pattern that the baby shower represents. The social media campaigns about toxic in-laws, the legal research about limiting grandparent access, the systematic undermining of my relationships with mutual friends and family members." Jessica's face went pale, and I watched her realize that I knew about activities she had assumed were private. David looked between us with obvious confusion, clearly unaware of the extent of his wife's anti-Margaret campaign. "I don't know what you think you know, but you're misinterpreting normal boundary setting as something malicious," Jessica said, but her voice lacked its usual conviction. "Am I misinterpreting the recordings you made of our private phone conversations? The documentation you've been keeping of my so-called boundary violations? The legal consultation about preventing me from developing a relationship with my grandchild?" The silence that followed was profound. David stared at his wife with an expression of shock and growing understanding. Jessica looked like she was calculating her options, deciding whether to continue denying or to shift to a different strategy. "David, did you know that your wife has been planning to severely limit my access to my grandchild while continuing to accept my financial support?" I asked gently. "That's not. I mean, we've talked about boundaries, but..." David's voice trailed off as he began connecting dots he had previously ignored or rationalized. "Jessica, would you like to explain to David about your research into grandparents' rights laws? Or your group chat discussions about toxic in-law management strategies?" Jessica's composure finally cracked completely. "You have no right to spy on me or investigate my private conversations. I have every right to make informed decisions about my financial and emotional investments in relationships. You've been planning to exclude me while taking my money. That's not boundary setting. Jessica, that's manipulation." The conversation continued for 2 hours, with Jessica alternately denying, minimizing, and defending her behavior, while David struggled to process the extent of what had been happening behind his back. By the end of the evening, the power dynamic that had defined our relationship for 2 years had shifted permanently. Jessica finally understood that I was not the accommodating pushover she had been manipulating. David finally understood that his wife's boundary setting had crossed the line into systematic exclusion and emotional manipulation. And I finally felt like I was participating in honest family relationships rather than being managed like a problem, to be solved. The financial boundaries I had established were just the beginning. The real change was that I had reclaimed my voice, my dignity, and my right to be treated with basic respect by people who wanted my love and support. Jessica's strategic campaign against me had backfired spectacularly, teaching me exactly how strong I could be when I stopped prioritizing accommodation over authenticity. The week following our confrontation brought an uneasy quiet to our family, dynamics, like the stillness that precedes a major storm. Jessica had retreated into wounded silence. David was processing revelations that had shattered his understanding of his marriage, and I was waiting to see how they would respond to the new reality I had established. But nothing could have prepared me for the phone call I received on Thursday evening from Detective Maria Santos of the Westfield Police Department. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm calling about a complaint that was filed against you earlier today. I need to ask you some questions about your recent interactions with your daughter-in-law, Jessica Thompson." My blood turned to ice water in my veins. "I'm sorry, what kind of complaint?" Mrs. Thompson filed a report alleging harassment and financial coercion. She claims you've been threatening her and using money to manipulate her family relationships. She's also mentioned concerns about her safety and the safety of her unborn child. The room seemed to tilt around me as I processed what Detective Santos was telling me. Jessica hadn't just been planning to exclude me from my grandchild's life. She had been building a case to potentially have me arrested or legally restricted from any contact with my own family. Detective Santos, I think there's been a serious misunderstanding. I've never threatened anyone, and I certainly haven't done anything to endanger Jessica or her baby. I understand this is difficult, Mrs. Thompson, but I need to ask you to come to the station tomorrow morning to discuss the allegations. You're welcome to bring an attorney, and I want to assure you that no charges have been filed at this time. We're simply investigating the complaint. After hanging up, I sat in my kitchen shaking, not from fear but from the sheer audacity of what Jessica had attempted. She had taken my decision to establish financial boundaries and transformed it into a criminal complaint, trying to use the legal system to punish me for refusing to continue subsidizing my own mistreatment. I immediately called James Harrison, who listened to my explanation with growing outrage before promising to meet me at the police station the next morning. Then I called Amanda, who provided the professional perspective I needed to understand what Jessica was really attempting. Mom, this is called DARVO, Deny, Attack, Reverse Victim and Offender. It's a classic manipulation tactic where the actual aggressor tries to reframe themselves as the victim when their behavior is exposed. Jessica is trying to make you the bad guy for defending yourself against her systematic exclusion. But can she actually have me arrested for stopping financial support? Absolutely not. You have every legal right to determine how you spend your own money, but she's hoping to intimidate you into backing down, or at least to create a public narrative where you're the unstable aggressor and she's the innocent victim. That night, I barely slept, but not because I was worried about the legal implications of Jessica's complaint. I was furious that she had escalated our family conflict to involve law enforcement, potentially creating lasting damage to relationships and reputations over her inability to accept accountability for her own behavior. Friday morning, James and I met with Detective Santos, who turned out to be a middle-aged Latina woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She had clearly dealt with family conflicts before and seemed to understand the complexities involved in disputes that mixed emotional and financial elements. Mrs. Thompson, I've reviewed the complaint, and I have to say that most of what Mrs. Jessica Thompson is alleging doesn't constitute criminal behavior. She mentions that you withdrew financial support after learning about her plans to limit your relationship with your grandchild. but that's your legal right as the owner of those funds. James provided documentation of all the financial arrangements and modifications, demonstrating that everything had been done through proper legal channels with appropriate professional oversight. He also shared copies of the communications I had received from Sarah and Rebecca, establishing that Jessica's plans to exclude me were well documented and had been discussed with multiple family members. Detective Santos, my client has been the victim of a systematic campaign to isolate her from her family while maintaining access to her financial resources. The complaint you received appears to be retaliation for her decision to protect herself from further manipulation. I'm inclined to agree, Detective Santos replied. Mrs. Jessica Thompson's complaint seems to be more about family dynamics than criminal behavior. However, I do need to ask you directly, Mrs. Thompson. Have you made any threats toward your daughter-in-law or expressed any intentions to harm her or her baby? Absolutely not. I love my son, and I want nothing but happiness and safety for his wife and child. My only goal has been to establish honest relationships based on mutual respect rather than financial obligation. Detective Santos nodded thoughtfully. I'm going to close this complaint as unfounded, but I want to give you some advice. Family conflicts that involve money can escalate quickly, and emotions can cloud judgment on all sides. You might want to consider having a neutral third party help facilitate future family discussions. After leaving the police station, James and I discussed the broader implications of Jessica's attempt to criminalize our family conflict. He was concerned that her willingness to involve law enforcement suggested she might attempt other legal strategies to limit my access to my grandchild once the baby was born. Margaret, I think you need to be prepared for the possibility that Jessica will try to obtain restraining orders or other legal restrictions if she doesn't get her way through. Intimidation. Her complaint to the police suggests she's willing to use any available system to maintain control. What can I do to protect myself? Document everything. Every interaction, every conversation, every financial transaction. If she does try to obtain legal restrictions against you, we'll need comprehensive evidence that her allegations are false and that your behavior has been completely appropriate. That afternoon, I received an unexpected visit from David, who looked haggard and emotionally exhausted. He had clearly learned about Jessica's police complaint and was struggling to process this latest escalation of our family conflict. Mom, I can't believe Jessica called the police. When I found out what she had done, we had the biggest fight of our marriage. I told her that involving law enforcement in family financial decisions was completely inappropriate and potentially damaging to everyone involved. How is she justifying it? She says she felt threatened by your ultimatum about the money, and she was worried about what you might do if she didn't comply with your demands. But Mom, I know you. You would never threaten anyone, especially not a pregnant woman. David's support meant everything to me, but I could also see the toll that this situation was taking on his marriage and his emotional well-being. He was caught between a wife who was systematically escalating conflicts and a mother who was finally refusing to be manipulated, and the stress was clearly overwhelming him. David, I want you to know that I never intended for this situation to become so complicated or painful. All I wanted was to be treated with basic respect and to have an honest relationship with my family. I know, Mom, and I'm starting to understand that Jessica's approach to managing family relationships has been much more controlling than I realized. The police complaint made me see how far she's willing to go to get her way, and it's not the person I thought I married. We talked for over an hour about the patterns in Jessica's behavior that had become impossible to ignore once they were viewed comprehensively. David admitted that he had been making excuses for increasingly unreasonable demands and had been enabling behavior that he wouldn't have tolerated from anyone else. What happens now? He asked. That depends on what Jessica decides to do next. I've established my boundaries, and I'm not going to compromise them regardless of what tactics she uses to try to force my compliance. But I also love you and want to be part of my grandchild's life, so I'm hoping she'll eventually choose cooperation over conflict. That evening, I received a text message from Jessica for the first time in weeks. "We need to talk. Can you come over tomorrow morning?" Saturday morning found me driving to David and Jessica's house with a mixture of anticipation and wariness. Jessica's request for a meeting felt significant, but I had learned not to trust her motivations or assume that apparent conciliation represented genuine change. I was prepared for anything from an apology to another attempt at manipulation. The colonial house that I had helped them purchase and furnish looked peaceful in the autumn sunlight, its manicured lawn dotted with fallen leaves and its windows reflecting the clear blue sky. But as I approached the front door, I noticed details that suggested the harmony of the exterior was masking considerable turmoil within. The morning newspaper was still lying on the walkway, the potted plants flanking the entrance were wilted from neglect, and Jessica's car was parked at an odd angle as if she had been distracted or upset when she arrived home. Jessica answered the door herself, and I was struck by how different she looked from the confident, glowing pregnant woman I had seen just weeks earlier. Her face was pale and drawn. Her usually perfect hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and her eyes were rimmed with the kind of exhaustion that comes from stress rather than simple fatigue. At 8 months pregnant, she moved carefully, one hand supporting her lower back in a gesture that seemed more protective than necessary. "Thank you for coming, Margaret. I know this week has been difficult for everyone." The use of my first name rather than her usual formal address was notable, suggesting either genuine attempt at connection or calculated strategy to appear more personal and vulnerable. I followed her into the living room, which showed signs of recent tension: magazines scattered on the coffee table, throw pillows askew on the sofa, and a general sense of disruption that contrasted sharply with Jessica's usual meticulous home maintenance. "Can I get you something to drink? Coffee or tea?" "Coffee would be lovely, thank you." As Jessica moved slowly toward the kitchen, I noticed that the nursery renovation I had funded was finally complete. Through the open doorway, I could see the beautiful space with its carefully coordinated colors and expensive furniture, looking like something from a design magazine but feeling oddly sterile in its perfection. The antique rocking chair I had offered months ago was nowhere to be seen. When Jessica returned with our coffee, she settled carefully into the armchair across from me, her hands wrapped around her mug as if seeking warmth despite the comfortable temperature of the room. For several moments we sat in silence, and I realized she was struggling to begin whatever conversation she had planned. "Margaret, I owe you an apology. Several apologies, actually." The admission surprised me, both for its directness and for the genuine emotion in her voice. But I had learned to be cautious about Jessica's apparent sincerity, so I waited for her to continue rather than immediately accepting or encouraging her words. "I've been handling our relationship badly from the beginning, and this week made me realize how far I've strayed from the person I want to be. Calling the police was wrong, and I'm embarrassed that I let my emotions override my judgment so completely." "What prompted this change of perspective?" Jessica took a shaky breath, and I could see tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "David and I have been talking for days about everything that's happened, and he helped me see patterns in my behavior that I hadn't recognized before. He also showed me some things I had written about you that made me realize how unfairly I've been characterizing your generosity and involvement." She went on to explain that David had confronted her with evidence of her social media campaigns, her legal research, and her systematic efforts to undermine my relationships with mutual friends and family members. He had demanded explanations for behavior that he found increasingly difficult to defend or rationalize. "But more than that, Margaret, I've been thinking about what kind of mother I want to be and what kind of family environment I want to create for this baby. The anger and conflict I've been generating isn't good for anyone, especially not for a child who deserves to grow up surrounded by love and connection rather than tension and exclusion." The acknowledgement of responsibility was more comprehensive than I had expected, but I remained cautious about accepting it at face value. Jessica had demonstrated considerable skill at manipulation and strategic thinking, and this apparent transformation could be another calculated attempt to regain control of our relationship dynamics. Jessica, I appreciate your apology, and I'm glad you're reflecting on these issues, but I need to understand what changed. Just a few days ago, you were willing to involve law enforcement in our family conflict. That's not a small escalation that can be easily explained away by stress or miscommunication. Jessica's composure cracked slightly, and I watched her struggle with emotions that seemed genuine but complicated. I was scared, Margaret. Scared of losing control of my life and my family. Scared of being overshadowed by someone with more experience and resources. Scared of not being good enough or strong enough to manage everything on my own. But instead of talking to me about those fears, you decided to eliminate me as a perceived threat. Yes, and that was wrong. I convinced myself that you were trying to control us, but really I was the one trying to control everything. I was so focused on establishing my independence that I forgot about the value of family support and connection. The conversation continued for over an hour, with Jessica providing detailed acknowledgments of specific behaviors and decisions that had damaged our relationship. She admitted to the social media campaigns, the legal research, the attempts to undermine my other relationships, and the systematic exclusion from family events and decisions. But as we talked, I began to sense that something wasn't quite right about this apparent transformation. Jessica's apologies were comprehensive and well-articulated, but they felt rehearsed rather than spontaneous. Her emotional responses seemed calculated to evoke sympathy rather than express genuine remorse. Most tellingly, her apologies focused primarily on the impact of her behavior on her own reputation and marriage, rather than on the hurt she had caused me. Jessica, I want to believe that you're sincere about changing our relationship, but I need to see consistent actions over time rather than just words. Apologies are important, but they don't automatically undo the damage that's been done or guarantee that the patterns won't repeat. I understand that, and I'm prepared to prove my sincerity through my actions. In fact, I wanted to discuss how we might move forward together. This was the moment I had been waiting for, the revelation of what Jessica actually wanted from this conversation. Her apologies had been building toward a specific request or proposal, and I suspected it would involve reinstating the financial arrangements I had modified. What did you have in mind? Well, David and I have been struggling financially since you adjusted the support arrangements. The monthly assistance was helping us manage our mortgage and prepare for the baby's arrival, and without it, we're facing some difficult decisions about our living situation. There it was. Jessica's comprehensive apology had been designed to manipulate me into restoring the financial support she needed, regardless of whether she had actually changed her fundamental attitudes about our relationship. She was using apparent vulnerability and contrition as tools to regain access to my resources. Jessica, the financial modifications weren't punishment for your behavior. They were alignment of my support with the actual relationship dynamics you had established. If you want financial assistance from someone, you need to treat them like a valued family member rather than an ATM with inconvenient emotional needs. But we do value you as a family member. I know I haven't always shown it properly, but that doesn't mean the feelings aren't there. Actions speak louder than feelings, Jessica. You spent months planning to exclude me from my grandchild's life while continuing to accept my money. That's not the behavior of someone who values family relationships. The mask of contrition began to slip as Jessica realized her strategy wasn't working as planned. Her voice took on a harder edge, and her posture became more defensive as she shifted from supplication to justification. Margaret, I think you're being unreasonable. Family relationships are complicated, and everyone needs time to adjust and find their balance. You're punishing us financially for normal boundary setting processes. Normal boundary setting doesn't involve legal research about limiting grandparent access or police complaints about harassment. Normal boundary setting involves honest conversation and mutual respect, neither of which characterized your approach to our relationship. The conversation deteriorated quickly from that point, with Jessica's apparent remorse giving way to familiar patterns of blame and victimization. She accused me of being vindictive, of using money to control people, and of being unable to accept reasonable boundaries around her nuclear family autonomy. By the time I left their house, it was clear that Jessica's apology had been a strategic manipulation rather than genuine acknowledgement of wrongdoing. She wanted to restore the financial benefits of our relationship without accepting responsibility for the behaviors that had made those modifications necessary. Nothing had fundamentally changed except her tactics. The following Monday brought an unexpected opportunity to demonstrate the resilience I had been developing when Patricia called to invite me to lunch at our usual cafe in downtown Westfield. Her voice carried an urgency that suggested this wasn't a casual social invitation, and I found myself curious about what Jessica's mother wanted to discuss. Patricia was already seated when I arrived, her expression serious but not unfriendly. Over the past few months, she had become one of my most reliable allies in understanding Jessica's behavior, providing insights that helped me navigate the complex family dynamics while maintaining her own relationship with her daughter. Margaret, I wanted to talk to you about what happened this weekend. Jessica told me about your conversation, and I'm concerned about how she's processing the situation. How so? She's interpreting your refusal to restore financial support as confirmation that your previous generosity was manipulative and conditional. She's not taking responsibility for the behaviors that made your boundary setting necessary. Patricia went on to explain that Jessica had been seeking validation from friends and family members for her victim narrative, portraying my financial modifications as emotional abuse and manipulation. She was doubling down on her previous characterizations of my behavior, rather than acknowledging the legitimacy of my response to her systematic exclusion. But here's what I wanted to tell you, Margaret. Not everyone is buying Jessica's version of events. Several people have approached me privately to express concern about how she's been treating you, and some have directly challenged her claims about your behavior. This information was both validating and concerning. It confirmed that Jessica's manipulation tactics weren't universally successful, but it also suggested that she was continuing to wage a public relations campaign against me rather than focusing on genuine relationship repair. Patricia, can I ask you something directly? Do you think Jessica is capable of maintaining healthy family relationships? Or is this pattern of control and manipulation likely to continue? Patricia considered the question carefully before responding. I love my daughter, but I'm worried about her ability to accept that other people have legitimate needs and boundaries too. She's always been someone who needs to be in control of situations, and becoming a mother seems to have intensified that tendency rather than softening it. The conversation with Patricia lasted 2 hours, and by the end, I had a clearer understanding of both Jessica's psychological patterns and the broader family dynamics that had shaped her approach to relationships. Patricia offered to continue serving as a bridge between us, but she also warned me that Jessica was unlikely to change her fundamental attitudes without professional intervention. That afternoon, I received a call that lifted my spirits considerably. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, the director of the Westfield Community Center's senior programs, was inviting me to chair their new initiative for intergenerational family support services. Margaret, your background in financial planning and your recent experience with complex family dynamics make you uniquely qualified to help other families navigate similar challenges. We're looking for someone who understands both the practical and emotional aspects of family financial relationships. The opportunity felt like validation of everything I had learned through my ordeal with Jessica. My experience of being systematically excluded while providing financial support had given me insights that could help other families avoid similar patterns of manipulation and boundary confusion. I'd be honored to chair the initiative, Dr. Warren. When can we begin? Actually, we have our first family consultation scheduled for Thursday. It's a grandmother who's being excluded from her grandchildren's lives while being expected to provide childcare and financial support. Sound familiar? The irony wasn't lost on me. 3 months ago, I had been that grandmother, confused and hurt by treatment I couldn't understand. Now I was being asked to help others navigate similar challenges from a position of knowledge and strength. Thursday's consultation was with Eleanor Richardson, a 70-year-old widow whose daughter-in-law had been systematically limiting her access to her twin grandsons while expecting her to provide free babysitting and emergency financial assistance. Eleanor's story was remarkably similar to mine, complete with social media campaigns, legal research, and attempts to criminalize normal boundary setting. Eleanor, the first thing I want you to understand is that you're not responsible for managing other people's unreasonable expectations. You have the right to be treated with respect and inclusion, especially when you're providing significant support to their family. Working with Eleanor over the following weeks was therapeutic for both of us. She was able to establish appropriate boundaries with her son and daughter-in-law, while I was able to use my experience to help someone else avoid the months of confusion and self-doubt I had endured. More importantly, the consultation work gave me a sense of purpose that had been missing since Robert's death. I was using my professional skills and personal experience to help families build healthier relationships, turning my painful experience with Jessica into something valuable for others. 3 weeks before Jessica's due date, I received a phone call that I had been both expecting and dreading. David's voice was strained with exhaustion and frustration as he explained the latest development in our ongoing family saga. "Mom, Jessica's been having complications with her blood pressure, and the doctor wants to induce labor early. She's scared about the delivery, and she's been asking about having you there for support." The request was stunning in its irony. After months of systematic exclusion and attempts to limit my involvement in their lives, Jessica was now seeking my presence during the most vulnerable and important moment of her pregnancy. The woman who had researched legal strategies for preventing me from developing a relationship with my grandchild was now asking me to be present for that child's birth. What exactly is she asking for, David? She wants you to be at the hospital during the delivery, and she's hoping you might consider helping with the baby's care during the first few weeks. She's realized that she's going to need more support than she initially planned for. The admission that Jessica needed my help was gratifying, but I was wary of being drawn back into patterns of accommodation without corresponding changes in how I was treated. I had learned too much about manipulation tactics to accept apparent vulnerability at face value. "David, I'm happy to support both of you during this important time, but I need to understand what's changed. A month ago, Jessica was researching ways to limit my access to the baby. Now she wants me present for the birth. That's a significant shift that requires explanation. She's been doing a lot of thinking about what kind of support system she wants for the baby, and she's realized that excluding you would deprive our child of a loving, capable grandmother. She wants to start over with a clean slate." The language of starting over was appealing, but I had learned to look for concrete evidence of change rather than accepting promises or intentions. Jessica had demonstrated considerable skill at saying what people wanted to hear while maintaining her underlying control strategies. "I'm willing to be present for the birth and to help during the recovery period, but I need clear agreements about expectations and boundaries. I won't participate in another cycle of being needed during crises, but excluded during normal times." We arranged to meet that evening to discuss specific agreements about my involvement in the baby's early care. When I arrived at their house, Jessica was visibly anxious, her face showing the strain of late pregnancy complications and the stress of our prolonged family conflict. "Margaret, I know I haven't been fair to you, and I know my apologies haven't been backed up by consistent actions, but I'm hoping we can find a way to move forward that works for everyone. Jessica, I'm willing to try, but I need honest communication about what you actually want from me, rather than strategic manipulation designed to get temporary access to my help. I want you to be involved in our family, I want our baby to have a relationship with his grandmother. And I want to stop fighting about boundaries and control and focus on creating a loving environment for our child. The conversation was more direct and honest than any we had shared previously, with both of us acknowledging the behaviors and decisions that had damaged our relationship. Jessica admitted that her fear of being overshadowed had led her to try to eliminate perceived threats rather than building collaborative relationships. But Margaret, I also need you to understand that some of my boundary setting came from genuine concerns about maintaining my role as this baby's mother. I was afraid that your experience and confidence would make me feel inadequate or unnecessary. Jessica, supporting you as a mother doesn't require diminishing you as a person. Good family relationships are collaborative rather than competitive. There's room for both of us to love and care for this baby without anyone being diminished or displaced. We spent 3 hours working through specific agreements about my involvement in the baby's care, my ongoing financial support, and the family dynamics we wanted to establish. By the end of the evening, we had created a framework that acknowledged both Jessica's legitimate need for autonomy and my legitimate role as a grandmother. 2 days later, I received David's call at 6 a.m. "Mom, we're heading to the hospital. Jessica's in labor." The birth of Thomas David Thompson at 7:42 p.m. on November 15th was the most transformative moment of the entire ordeal that had defined our family relationships for the past year. As I held my grandson for the first time, his tiny fingers wrapped around mine and his dark eyes studying my face with the serious concentration that newborns bring to their first encounters with the world, I felt the anger and hurt of the past, months dissolving into something more powerful and enduring. Jessica, exhausted but radiant after 12 hours of labor, watched from her hospital bed as I cradled her son. For the first time since I had known her, there was no calculation in her expression, no strategic consideration of what my presence might mean for her control over family dynamics. She was simply a new mother, overwhelmed by love and responsibility, grateful for the support of people who cared about her and her child. "He's perfect," I whispered, studying Thomas's delicate features and marveling at the miracle of new life. "Absolutely perfect." "Would you like to hold him while I try to get some rest?" Jessica asked, and I heard genuine trust in her voice for the first time. Those first hours in the hospital were unlike anything I had experienced since Robert's death. The quiet intensity of caring for a newborn, the shared exhaustion and wonder that come with welcoming a new family member, and the sense of being truly needed and valued, created a bond between Jessica and me that all our previous conflicts couldn't diminish. David alternated between proud father and anxious husband, taking pictures and making phone calls while ensuring that Jessica had everything she needed for recovery. But it was the moments when he watched me caring for his son that meant the most to me. His face showed the recognition that his child was benefiting from having multiple adults who loved him unconditionally. "Mom, I'm sorry it took so long for us to get to this place," he said during one of Jessica's naps. "I should have addressed the family dynamics earlier instead of hoping everyone would just figure it out." "We're here now, sweetheart. That's what matters." The first weeks of Thomas's life established patterns that would have been unimaginable during the height of our family conflicts. Jessica called me daily with questions about feeding schedules, sleeping arrangements, and infant care concerns. Instead of viewing my experience as threatening competition, she began treating it as valuable resource that enhanced her own capabilities as a mother. I spent 3 days a week at their house during Jessica's recovery, helping with household tasks, cooking meals, and providing the kind of practical support that new parents desperately need but often struggle to ask for. The financial arrangements I had established remained in place, but they no longer felt punitive or strategic. They were simply the framework for sustainable family relationships based on mutual respect and appropriate boundaries. More importantly, Jessica began acknowledging my contributions publicly, rather than hiding or minimizing them. Her social Media posts about early motherhood included grateful mentions of the grandmother who was helping her navigate the challenges of caring for a newborn. The narrative she had been crafting about toxic in-law relationships was replaced by posts about the value of intergenerational support and family connection. "Margaret, I need to tell you something," Jessica said during one of our quiet moments together while Thomas napped. "I've been thinking about all the energy I wasted trying to exclude you from our lives, and I realize how much I deprived myself of valuable support and friendship. What made you see things differently?" Becoming a mother made me understand how precious family relationships are. I don't want Thomas to grow up in an environment where people who love him are fighting for position or control. I want him to be surrounded by adults who collaborate rather than compete. The transformation in Jessica wasn't complete or perfect, but it was genuine and sustained. She still had moments of wanting to control situations or feeling threatened by other people's expertise, but she had learned to recognize those impulses and address them directly, rather than acting on them destructively. 6 months after Thomas's birth, Jessica surprised me by asking if I would consider moving closer to their family. The request came during one of our regular coffee dates, a tradition we had established to maintain our relationship independently of childcare responsibilities. "I've been thinking about how much Thomas benefits from having you involved in his daily life, and I've realized that I benefit from it too. You've become one of my most trusted advisors about parenting and family management, and I'd love to have you more accessible." The request represented a complete reversal of her previous desire to limit my involvement, but I was cautious about making major life changes based on improved but still developing relationships. Instead, I suggested that we continue building our connection gradually while maintaining the independence that had proven valuable for all of us. "Jessica, I'm grateful that you value my involvement, but I think the current arrangement works well because it allows me to be supportive without being overwhelming. Sometimes the best family relationships are the ones that don't involve constant proximity." A year later, as Thomas celebrated his first birthday, I reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought our family to this place of genuine connection and mutual respect. The woman who had once researched legal strategies for excluding me was now consulting me about major parenting decisions. The son who had been caught between competing loyalties was now confidently managing family relationships that enhanced rather than diminished everyone involved. The birthday party was held in my backyard, with Thomas taking his first tentative steps across the lawn that had once felt too quiet and empty. Jessica's parents, my sister Linda, and several family friends gathered to celebrate not just Thomas's first year of life, but the family relationships that had been rebuilt stronger than they had ever been before. "Margaret, I have something for you," Jessica said as the party was winding down. She handed me a beautifully wrapped package that contained a photo album documenting Thomas's first year, with pictures I had never seen and captions that told the story of our family's journey from conflict to connection. The final page contained a handwritten letter. "To the grandmother who taught me that family relationships are worth fighting for, even when the fight is with yourself. Thank you for refusing to let me exclude love from our lives. Thomas is lucky to have you, and so am I." As I read those words while watching my grandson play with the wooden blocks I had given him, I realized that the woman I had become through this ordeal was stronger, wiser, and more authentic than the accommodating mother-in-law I had been before. I had learned that genuine family relationships require mutual respect, honest communication, and the courage to maintain appropriate boundaries even when doing so creates temporary conflict. Jessica had learned that control and connection are not the same thing, and that the strongest families are built on collaboration rather than dominance. David had learned that avoiding conflict doesn't resolve it, and that healthy family relationships require active maintenance rather than hopeful neglect. Most importantly, Thomas was growing up in an environment where the adults who loved him had learned to love each other as well, creating the kind of family foundation that would serve him throughout his life. The story that began with public Humiliation at a country club brunch had evolved into something none of us could have predicted. A family that was stronger, more honest, and more loving than it had ever been before. Sometimes the best gifts come wrapped in the most challenging experiences, and sometimes the people who push us the hardest are the ones who help us discover who we're truly capable of becoming. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.